So economics as a social science makes a lot of assumptions, right? Makes a lot of assumptions about how people act, how people behave, and sometimes these don't really fit in to the ways that we see people behaving, right? So that's our first objection that we have here, is that people, firms, and society do not act in a way that fits the economic way of thinking. So, for instance, you go to Walmart later this week, are you going to be creating an imaginary budget constraint in your mind between the two goods that you're thinking about picking, and figuring out what combination you're going to get and how many bags of Cheerios compared to how many things of milk you're going to get, or whatever the case may be? No, right? Like you go to the store and you buy the stuff that you're going to get. Similarly, do our representatives and Congress make a production possibility frontier before they're voting on the next spending bill and try to figure out where they want to be along the production possibility frontier? No, they don't, right? So why do we learn these models? Well, we're learning how to think about economic issues, right? And we're also, in the same way that a basketball player doesn't necessarily know all the formula for the physics and the math of when they do a bounce pass to somebody when they're going 6 miles an hour and the other person's going 3 miles an hour, right? They don't know the exact movement of that ball as it bounce passes to the other person, in the same way that if you took film of it and had a physicist and a mathematician break it down, they could actually give us the model. They could give us the equations for it and they could predict it, right? But that person, that's that basketball person, they're able to pass that ball and the other person is able to catch it, right? So in the same way, the basketball player doesn't need to know all the physics and interactions and all the mathematical equations that are underlying the way that the ball bounces when you're running at this state and it's this coefficient of friction on the floor, right? The basketball, they have all this ingrained kind of subconscious knowledge. And similarly, consumers, right? Consumers have, a similar way in which they go about their actions, and they may not be using these kind of calculus decision-making frameworks, but it's reasonable to analyze them with these tools of economic analysis. So despite the fact that we're all not using economics in our day-to-day, the use of economics to evaluate our day-to-day can make for some very interesting and actionable conclusions that business owners, industry leaders, policymakers can then use to help improve everyone's lives. So yes, we don't always think like this, but sometimes using models to explain why we do the things we do is helpful, even if we don't necessarily use those models in our day-to-day shopping experience. Does that make sense, everyone? Okay. The second objection that we get is that perhaps people, firms, and society should not act this way. One of the things that we assume about people in economics is that they are rational, self-interested creatures. They go towards pleasure and they avoid pain. But this is a very simplistic notion, right? What about family? What about friends? What about community? Right? Are you always going to do the thing that's going to bring you money, even if it, throws other people under the bus? Probably not. So, yes, economics portrays people as self-interested. And yes, there are exceptions to that. But for the most part, when we're talking about money, people are self-interested, right? And people do things because it adds to their profit or it adds to their bank account, right? And at the end of the day, economics is not a form of moral instruction. For the most part, economics seeks to describe economic behavior as it actually exists. And so this is where we get into the distinction between positive and normative statements. So in economics, we can split it into positive statements. These are facts. These are statements that tell us the world as it is. You know, inflation is at 6%. That's a positive statement. Now, what if I said inflation is too high for the Federal Reserve to stop their program of raising interest rates, right? Well, that is what's called a normative statement. Normative statements describe how the world should be. Normative statements are statements of opinion. Oh, sorry, jumped around there. And positive statements are statements of fact. Now, when we're talking about self-interest, we have to talk about Adam Smith, right? The founder of economics, published his Wealth of Nations in 1776, published Theory of Moral Sentiments shortly thereafter. And in the Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith identified this notion of an invisible hand. An invisible hand, which is the concept that individualizes self-interested behavior can lead to positive social outcomes. And so he talks about how people are led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distribution of the necessities of life, which would have been made had the earth been divided into equal proportions among its inhabitants, and thus, without intending it, without knowing it, advance the interest of society. Let's do a different quote. Hold on. Butcher, Baker, Adam Smith. So he said, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love, and never talk to them of our own necessities, but of their advantages." So that is the crux of the invisible hand, which essentially says that, consumers are going to encourage businesses to offer goods and services that meet their needs. And it's in this way that broader social good can emerge from selfish individual actions. And lastly, but not leastly, self-interest in economics does not necessarily imply self-interest in all the aspects of your life, right? Just because you're self-interested in economics doesn't mean you have to be selfish in every other aspect. Questions on invisible hand, positive versus normative statements? All right, let's go ahead and do our Kahoot.